All right, looks like most of us are here, so let's get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Dive Deep into Self-Service Analytics webinar. We've put together some really great content for you today to help you build up your skills and knowledge around hydro analytics and how the powerful combo of Ultrix and Tableau can help you better understand your data. But just a quick note before we get started, today's session is in listen-only mode, so if you have any questions, just type them into that questions box below and we'll do our best to get them answered throughout the presentation. And for those of you wondering, we will record the session and I'll send out the copy of the slides as well. So joining us today, we have Kathleen Songen from our team. Kathleen is many things here at Newcomb. She's a data scientist. She's one of our Tableau and Ultrix certified instructors. So really feel free to ask away any questions. And yeah, hope you enjoy the presentation. So at this point, Kathleen, take it away.
Great, thanks, Alex. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for this deep dive session into self-service analytics. I already got a bit of an intro, but just wanted to talk a little bit about myself. So as I said, my name's Kathleen Songen. I'm a data scientist at Newcomb Analytics. Some of my background, I have a degree in physics and math and also a master's degree in engineering. And as you might know, this webinar today is geared towards more of a hydro kind of energy type webinar. And the reason I bring up my credentials is in my master's degree, I actually worked on a micro hydro renewable energy source called Archimedes screw turbines. So I'm actually going to be talking a little bit about them using data that I've used in my master's, and afterwards kind of put that into Ultrix and see how that transitions into Tableau in order to gain some valuable insights. As you ask questions throughout, again, trying to monitor questions, and I'll also leave some time at the end in case anybody has anything additional to say. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do today, what some of the goals are. So we want to kind of explore the relationship between Ultrix and Tableau, bring some data in, and also present it in a way that's meaningful for your user. So we're going to explore both Ultrix and Tableau, look at some more advanced concepts, and look at how they work together, especially when it comes towards Tableau server. We want to build a workflow. We're going to import some data from completely different data sources, clean them up, prep them, do some spatial analysis on those two sources, and then do some clustering analysis by utilizing Ultrix's predictive tool palette. And then we're going to push that data directly into Tableau server and show some of the new features of Tableau server, so how you can gain some valuable insights from your predictive data, because you could show the results of the predictive model, but we want to see how that actually looks and how someone can look at that and interpret it in a meaningful way. A little bit about the data that we're going to be using today. I just took some sources, like I said, from my master's degree, but this all comes from Ontario's Open Data Catalog. If you're unfamiliar with it, you can go online, take a look. They just have a lot of information about, for example, municipal boundaries. And there's also some information about potential hydro sites. So this data that we're using with the potential hydro sites essentially just looks at different rivers, streams, watersheds, and water sources around Ontario, and has some information like the potential power that you could generate from there by looking at things like the flow and also the height of that water stream. And I'll talk a little bit more about that data as well. The image I have on the right is just an example of what I was talking about in terms of renewable energy. So on the right-hand side, I'll just get my laser pointer here. I have an Archimedes screw turbine. So just to have everyone an idea in their head of how it looks like, just in case they're unfamiliar, just a long shaft with a helical blade wrapped around it. And it's traditionally used to carry water uphill, but used in reverse can screw a turbine in order to create generate some energy. So when we're looking at this data, it has some information that will be useful for us. I just want to make sure just to get a brief understanding for everybody. I'll talk about something called head a lot, and that's just the height of the water. So for example, water falling over Niagara Falls, water falling down a little bit of a waterfall, how high is it? And then I'll talk about flow rate as well. So that's how fast the flow of water is moving throughout. So just if I'm using those terms a lot, head and flow rate, this diagram I have here, just different types of turbines that work with a combination of each of them. Again, all this data I got online from the online catalog, and we're going to use it in order to create a workflow. So when we start creating a workflow, we first want to start off with Ultrix, and Ultrix is great because it excels at performing complex tasks simply, and it saves a lot of time. All the tools we'll be using are drag and drop, and they're all confined within a single space, so everything is easily accessible. It provides a large range of pre-made tools that range from data investigation, data preparation, and more complex data manipulation with pivots and transposes, a lot of R-based predictive tools, as well as spatial tools. So we're gonna use tools in the system so we can easily track data changes and then make a repeatable process that we can use over and over again. So as the data updates, you'll still have all those changes that are being made. The main goal of Ultrix is to get your data, blend and prep it, analyze it, which we'll be doing with the spatial analysis and predictive modeling, and then sharing it in a way that's useful for everybody. And this will be useful for when we're looking at that data in Tableau. So let me just open up Ultrix here. So how I'm going to do it is I don't really like to spend a lot of time in the slides. Instead, I'm just going to spend most of the time in the actual tools talking a little bit about it. If you're already familiar with the tools, which I understand some of you are, I'm only just going to give brief intros on each section, but then we'll go through kind of build a workflow together and talk about some of the different features, some more advanced features that I wanted to pinpoint. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, when I open up the Ultrix Designer tool, this is how it looks like on the screen when I first open it up. There is a couple sections to keep in mind. The top left-hand side of my screen, this is where I would open and save workflows. So workflow is something that we're going to build in order to bring together and manipulate our data. Then underneath, I have all these tabs: in and out, preparation, join. These tabs are palettes. They contain all the tools that I need in order to build my workflows. You can think of them as chapters in a book or a textbook, and they all have tools based on their different headers. For example, in my in and out palette, I have a variety of tools that are used for bringing in data or outputting data as well. In preparation, we have different ways that we can prep our data. So filter out, use formulas, create a sample of records, sort them, etc. And as we go through the list, we'll kind of talk about each of these tools, how we're going to use them. Then there's also more advanced tools like Spatial Tools, which we'll touch on today. So this explicitly or specifically works for all those geographical tools that you want to see. Also, it has a whole predictive tool palette. So there's a bunch of palettes that have a little R located at the icon, and this just means it's using R-based coding in order to activate and create these tools. And some of the predictive components they have, for example, is you can do linear regression, logistic regression, they have neural networks, predictive grouping, which we'll cover today, and you can even go so far as market basket analysis. But what we want to do is we want to, like I said, create a workflow that takes in those two data sources that I have from Ontario's Open Data Catalog that has those potential hydro sites and those municipal boundaries. And I want to see which municipality I need to contact in order to place these Archimedes screw turbines in the correct section, which ones are viable for renewable energy and which ones are not, and which ones just to use for something else. So we're just going to dive in, get started, and start building the workflow. So I first want to start off by bringing in some type of data. So in my in and out palette, I have this input tool. You'll notice that when I select any of the tools, there is a little description of the tool and what it does. This is just good practice. So if you're really unsure what a tool does, you think one looks interesting, you could always look it up. In addition, if you want more information about a tool, you can always use the search bar located at the top right-hand side. So if I start typing in the input data tool, you'll see that the tool is available here. And also underneath, they're searching for help and also searching for in the community. So the Tableau, the Ultrix community is very, very good. I really, really like it, especially if you're first kind of exploring and using the tool. It has a lot of different features in order to learn the tool on your own, and also different ways to look at use cases from different companies that may be similar to yours. They also have a variety of different self-paced training that you can do in their academy. You can post your own specific question to the community, and more often than not, people will reply to you, and they will reply to you with the exact answer that you need. So especially when I first started learning it, it was very, very, very useful. One of the things that I like to show everybody if they're unfamiliar with it is looking at the Ultrix Academy under their interactive lessons. A lot of times people ask me, how do I use a VLOOKUP? How do I essentially do this Excel thing in Ultrix? And there's a whole section under interactive lessons, Ultrix for Excel users. It's very, very useful and a really good way to kind of transfer your skills from one set to another. Also, if you're interested in doing some spatial analytics, they also have those courses available to you as well. So a lot of different resources in order to learn the tool. The next thing that I wanted to point out is on the left-hand side, I have a configuration window for my tool. This configuration window on the left-hand side is going to change every single time I add in a new tool because it is going to determine what that tool does. So for example, here I have a input data tool, and it's asking me what data I want to input. So what file do I want to connect to? I'm going to select the drop down, and I can connect to a recent data source, a saved data source, a particular file, or I can also look through all the data sources that Ultrix connects to. So if you want, you can connect to Snowflake, set up your own ODBC connection, Teradata, Google Analytics, SQL, Salesforce, etc. A lot of different connections you can pull from, and all these connections you can also save to at the end. So when you want to output your data, you can output it, bring it in as an Excel, for example, and output it to a Microsoft SQL server. Also a really good way to convert file types, for example, from CSV to Excel or from one to another. There's also the Ultrix gallery. So this is if you have an Ultrix server license, you can store your data sources up on the Ultrix gallery and bring them in from here. In my case, I just want to connect to a file type, and you'll also see all the different file types available to you, from spatial files, which we'll be using, to CSVs. You can drag and drop your file connection right in the data file connections box that they have there, or you could specifically select a file. I'm going to select a file from some of my hydro data, and I have some water power in Ontario. So I'm going to select that and see how my configuration window changes on the left-hand side. I'm bringing in a CSV file. I have a preview of the first 100 records, and it looks like I have some type of ID, some type of site name, watershed information, and then you'll see some of these things come up again, like head, original area, flow, these things that I was talking about before, and how to determine when I have a good site. And I also have some geographical locations, a lot at latitude and longitude, but they're named in their short form lat and log, which is not a problem at all. The next thing I want to do, which is just good practice, is I want to bring in this tool called a browse tool, attach it to my input tool, and click run that's located on the top right-hand side. What the browse tool does is it's going to give you all of your data, and it's going to show you the data quality. Now, data quality is very important, as you may know, because a lot of times we build reports and we see that we have a lot of missing values. There might not be named the same. There could be discrepancies, some non-unique features. This browse tool is a really good way to just kind of look and gauge all your data to make sure that it's in the proper state before you decide how to clean it up. So if I click on my browse tool, I have a profile on the left-hand side for my frequency of OGF IDs. So these are all the IDs for my potential sites. It looks like my data is 100% okay. And it also gives me a summary of the data, including my data type. So this is coming in as a string field or some kind of word. Also tells me that I don't have any nulls, no leading and trailing spaces. However, if I look at my results window, which is located at the bottom of the screen, and I hover over site name, it looks like 33.99% of my data is not okay, and only 66 is okay. So by clicking on that site name header, my configuration window on the left-hand side changes, and it tells me what's going on with the data quality, how often some of these site names repeat, and what's essentially going on. So I can still see that metadata. I'm still looking at a string, but I see that 1,259 of my site names have leading white spaces. Now, this happens sometimes, as you know, with data, and the reason that we would have this tool is to amend something like that. You'll also see if I hover over Little Falls in my results window at the bottom, I have this little red nacho located at the top right-hand side of the cell. This is also telling me what's wrong, so I can always just hover over and see that the cell has leading spaces. Another error that I could get is null values, which is represented by this yellow color. So if I hover over original area, OMAF for original, I could also see all of these things that I need to clean up. Another thing that you'll notice is that the browse tool shows me what the data type is. But if I'm looking at my data in my results window, I also have a tab right beside it, kind of at the bottom on the right-hand side, called the metadata tab. This is going to tell me what type of data I have coming in. And because I've connected to a CSV file, it's saying that all my data types are strings. However, we know that that's not the case because if I head over and look at my data, I have flow, kilowatt, megawatt, head measurements, and they're all numerical values instead of being string values, which is automatically placed in. So rather than going through each one of these fields and manually changing the field type, Ultrix has a set of tools in order to start cleansing and preparing this data. So I'm going to start off by bringing the auto field tool into the workflow. And I'm going to select all of them except for the date. And I'll talk a little bit later about why I'm going to do that. And I'm going to go ahead and click run. Every tool that I select has an in and output button. It kind of looks like this fish, like a fish tail and a fish head at the end. And it's also available in the results window. And you can see between the input and output, nothing really changes other than the decimal places that I have on my numbers. But if I take a look at my metadata and see the before and after, what Ultrix did is it read all of my individual cells and it changed the data type to the smallest data type available. So now what was previously a string, I have doubles, integers, some strings, some variable strings in order to make the data run faster because integers just run faster than strings. And now this also means that I can create calculations and formulas based on my different fields. Another thing that I want to do is I want to do some data cleansing. So we talked a little bit about the null values that I had and some of the missing spaces or leading white spaces that I had for the site name. The data cleansing tool can look at all those blank fields or nulls, replace your nulls with zeros, or if it's a string field, replace it with a blank. It can get rid of those leading and trailing white spaces, get rid of unnecessary punctuation, and it could also modify the case. So for example, all of my site names and watersheds, or my site names rather, and water body names are all capital, but everything else is in title case, meaning the first letter of each word is capital. I can bring in the data cleansing tool, select all my fields, and when I look at my data before and after, not only are my site names now 100% okay, meaning I don't have any of those leading or trailing white spaces, I don't have any of those quotation marks around some of my watersheds. I also have all those null values filled in where I don't need them to be. And also I have all my values going into title case. So the first letter of each word is capitalized. So just some really quick ways that you could go ahead and clean up your data. You could also clean up your headers dynamically by using a tool called the Dynamic Rename tool. Now, the reason I'm typing in the dynamic rename tool in the search bar rather than looking it up in one of my palettes is I just wanted to show how even when you type in or search for a particular tool, you can still grab that tool from the search bar and bring it into the view. And what I want to do is I want to use a formula on all of these, but the dynamic rename tool also allows you to, for example, add a prefix or suffix to each of the headers, remove a prefix or suffix, take the headers from the first row of data, and just really kind of do all those changes at once rather than having to look at them one at a time. The formula that I'm going to apply to all these fields, which is in the expression at the bottom, is I'm going to use the current field and I'm going to change the case to title case. So this title case function is something that I've already done using the data cleansing tool, although it was embedded in the data cleansing tool already. With the dynamic rename tool, it just told me for the current field, which is just code for me saying each one of these headers, just change all those expressions to title case. And once again, if I look at the before and after, before I had everything capital, and after I had everything title case. So just little changes here in order for my data to look a little bit more visually appealing before I bring it into Tableau, and just make it more readable for the user. Speaking of making it more readable for the user, I also want to get some of these fields out of here that I know I'm not going to be using and that I know might confuse a report builder or something that's just unnecessary. So I'm going to go back to my preparation palette. I'm going to bring in my favorite tool called the Select tool. If you're ever unsure on how to use a tool, like I said, you can always select it in order to look at the description. But there's also a hyperlink under the icon. And if I open up that hyperlink, it's just going to open up a new page and shows you examples on how to use that tool. With the Select tool, what it does is it allows you to deselect fields you don't need, and it also allows you to change types. So for example, my OGF ID automatically got changed to an integer because it read it as a number. But I know that a row ID isn't necessarily a number that I want to add together. Instead, it's more of an indicator of my particular IDs. So I'm going to change that type from an integer back into a string. And you'll notice that any of my changes get highlighted in pink. This is just now the next person who goes in to look at my data knows that a change was made. And every time they update the data source, those changes will be made again. So you know every time you don't have to go through these steps all over and over again. You just have to update the data source and all these steps will repeat. I'm also going to change the name of cap_new MW just to MW. I'm going to change my short form of log to longitude, my lat to latitude, and I'm going to change my date to date. Then, like I said, I'm just going to get rid of some of these fields that I don't need because I'm not going to be using them in any of my calculations. I don't need any of these new old capacities rather. I don't need any of these flow numbers because I already have the overall flow. And I just don't need some of these details because, like I said, it could confuse the user. I still want to see the site names, the watershed names, and all this information about each one. So I'm going to leave those fields and then once again, look at my before and after. So after and before, all these fields that I had, so the original area, cap_new MW, I either got rid of them from the view or changed the name. Now, if I go back and I need to make a change, I could just go back to this tool and update the Select tool and run everything else like normal. Just because you add the tools doesn't mean you could go back and make another change. So that's great. I have all these tools set up. And there's one more metadata change that I wanted to talk about. So you may remember back when I was doing the autofill tool, I deselected date. The reason being is I wanted to keep it as a string field. Going forward with some of my tool palettes that I have in Ultrix, I have this tool called the DateTime Tool. Now, I know you're all muted, but normally when I go to a different client, I ask them, how do you guys do your date? Is it month, day, year, month, day, month, day, year, however way you do it? And the answer is always yes. because everybody's does date all these different ways and there's no kind of consistent way. So Ultrix has this tool called the DateTime Tool, and it allows you to bring in your date format and it will convert it in a way that's familiar to Ultrix, and it allows you to do calculations on them. So if I look at my results window and look at my date, it looks like I have year, month, and day without any delimiters in between them. So I brought in my DateTime tool. I looked at that field, change it to a date. And I have the code in order to change it right here on the left-hand side of my configuration window. I have year, month, and day. So after I run it, I have a new field at the end that puts it in the Ultrix format called day, month, year. And if I go to my metadata, I also have the metadata type, which is date. The reason that I did this, like I said, is that I wanted to perform a formula on this date. And I'm going to do that by going back to my preparation palette and bringing the formula tool into my view. Now, the formula tool is very, well, it's really, really cool. There's a lot of things you could do with it. I'm essentially going to create a new column that looks at the amount of months since the site has been active or since the site has been checked. The reason being is because, as you know, with kind of small head hydro sites, things can be overgrown really quickly if nobody's monitoring them. So I want to essentially create a flag that says, hey, this hasn't been checked in the past 6 months, past 10 months, for example, and I want to make sure that everything's being used. Now, a little bit about the formula tool. You can pretty much recreate anything that any tool that you want within the formulas. And there's a wide variety of functions that you can use and explore in Ultrix by clicking on the little drop downs in the formula window in the configuration window on the left-hand side. You could do different financial calculations, date time calculations, math, spatial, etc. But right now, I just want to do a simple date time difference formula. As I start typing in the formula, the function pops up, and it allows me to choose my start date, my end date, and how I want to look at that difference. I'm going to use another function called DateTime Now. So that essentially looks at today's date. And I want to compare it with that effective date that I just created using my DateTime tool. And I want to look at the difference between these two in months. So I have a little data preview located at the top, and it essentially says that on my top row, if I look at my effective date till now, what is the change in months? So a lot of these sites have not been checked in a long time, but that's fine because, again, this data is from my master's, so it's old data. But if I were to get the newest data for these water power sites and just plug it in here, then all these values would change and I would automatically have the updated data source. Another thing that's good practice is in one of my palettes, I have a button called documentation. Good practice to just add comments or notes. Formula was added here. Check for updated dates. So you could just add comments throughout to make sure that everything is being read properly, and when somebody goes back to look at this information, they'll have it. So looking from the beginning to the end, I started off with a bunch of data, some flaws, some leading and trailing spaces that I didn't need, some nulls, and ended up with a complete data flow, title cases throughout, consistencies, and wording that makes sense. Now, that's great. I have my data now. This is something that you could go through and put into Tableau or a reporting tool in order to use. But the point of this webinar is to take this data a step further by looking at where these sites are and how do they compare to the different boundaries. So I'm going to head over to some of my advanced tools, starting with the Spatial Tool, and I'm going to bring in my Create Points. Now, what this does is it takes my latitude and longitude and it creates points based on those different latitude and longitudes on a map. The reason this is important to see is because now you could see where all those sites are located and just how many we have across Ontario. Another thing that I want to do is I want to input a new data source. So I'm going to connect to a spatial file with those municipal boundaries, And those municipal boundaries are all the different municipalities I have to contact if I want to have a site within each of them. If I look at a preview of the data, I have some type of spatial objects and spatial areas as well. I'm going to bring a browse tool and run the view as well. Now you'll see a big difference here. When I click the browse tool, I don't see anything about data quality. Instead, I see a map. This is because the browse tool is going to adjust. If it sees a spatial file, like a latitude and longitude created by this create points tool, or if I automatically bring in a spatial file, the browse tool is not only going to look at a profile of my data, but it's also going to see that data displayed in its natural state. Natural state meaning if it's a string, it's gonna show a list. If it's a spatial file, it's gonna show a map. So now I have my municipal boundaries, I have my screw locations or my potential water locations, and I want to bring both of these together. And the way that I want to bring both of these together is I want to create a spatial match. So I'm going to go and use the find nearest tool or the spatial match tool, whichever one you want. I'm going to use find nearest specifically because I can see, especially in Northern Ontario, that a lot of these locations may not be within the municipal boundaries, but usually if they're around 50 kilometers outside of it, then I would count it as part of that particular region. So I'm going to bring in the find nearest tool, and I have a target input and a universe input. What this means is it's going to be looking at all those points, those potential water sites, and it's going to look at those polygons, those spatial boundaries. And I want to see which ones 50 kilometers outside each of those municipalities, including those ones within them, have hydro site locations. And you'll notice that I'm essentially joining these two data sets without creating a join. I'm looking at the spatial area of the polygon and the individual points, and I'm overlapping them on top of each other. And by overlapping them on top of each other, I can see where they intersect. And by seeing all those different intersections, I could get a better range of who to contact for each. I have two outputs. I have matched and unmatched. And if I look at my map, I've gone down from 3,000 points to 1,817. This makes sense because these are just lower boundaries, and I have a lot of upper boundary potential hydro sites that I don't have any jurisdiction in. So I'm going to stick with my match sites that I have underneath because I want to, again, link together all those different municipality information with that potential site name. On my map, if I could see a little individual site, there's a lot, so it's hard to highlight, but it kind of highlights on the map here, something we'll talk about a lot in Tableau as well. Another thing that I want to do is I want to do some predictive analysis by using predictive grouping. So I'm going to highlight all of these spatial tools, and I'm going to add them to a container, call it spatial. And I'm going to deactivate this container. The reason I want to do that is every time I run the workflow, the data loads from the front and it goes through all the different tools. If I left the spatial tools open and imagine I had millions of rows of data, every single time I ran the workflow, it would run and take that amount of time. By placing these spatial tools in a container and essentially closing them up, what I'm doing is I'm just hiding them from the view, so the only thing that runs are the tools that are visible to me. So now let's talk about some of our predictive components. I have a large number of sites, and I want to put them in a few categories: low, medium, high, or a predictive category, so something I don't know. Predictive modeling and clustering is commonly used when you're looking at demographic information, for example. I did this for almost all the major cities in Ontario at this point. I went online, I took whatever open data demographics was available, and I ran it against this predictive grouping tool. And it groups together people in similar demographic areas. So if you're living in a suburb, if you're living in a city, and it groups together ages, income base, number of cars, travel time to work, etc. So you could have all those different groupings. This is really good for marketing campaigns. I want to do something similar for these screw sites. I want to create some groupings, and I want to see which range of sites that I have so I can place them in particular categories. So what I did is I went to my predictive grouping tool palette, and I went to the K-centroid cluster, and I'm going to look at, head, my flow, and megawatts that are created. And I'm going to create a group, and I'm going to link this back with my original data in order to create what are called clusters. What these clusters do is they take the original data, and I'm going to assign a cluster, so 1, 2, 3, or 4, to each one of my potential sites. So when I show these sites in Tableau, I'll see a different way of how to group them together rather than me manually going through and grouping them one by one. So I'm going to run this workflow in order for them to come together. What this does is it essentially is a method of looking at each of those points, and it groups together points that are more or less similar. So for example, if I looked at the results of my clustering, and this is like advanced predictive, so if you want to see this, you can. If you don't, that's fine as well. I have 4 different clusters that were created, and I have the size of each of the clusters. You'll see that cluster number 2 only has 4 screws in it, or 4 potential hydro sites in it, which is not ideal because we want to have, 4 or 5 or 3 main clusters that kind of say, okay, this can be placed in the low group, this can be placed in the medium group, and this can be placed in the high group. We see that cluster 3 has a lot in common, and you can also see a breakdown of each of the cluster and what the averages are within each one of them. I want to link this back to my spatial data because I want to make sure that both of them are being run together. So I want to take that cluster, I want to take that code, so I want to look at that ID, and I want to look at the cluster associated with each ID, and I'm going to join back together the predictive tools that I just did and also the matched sites, because I only care about those sites that have the correct municipality for me. And if I have that, then I'll be able to have them in order to run all together. Now, after I join those 2 together, I can publish my results to Tableau, and specifically directly to the Tableau server. So if you, there's a add-on you could download to Ultrix called the Tableau Starter Kit, and it has something like this that's called Publish to Tableau Server. So it allows you to connect to your server or Tableau Online, depending on what you're looking at. And I'm just going to log into my instance of Tableau Online. I'm just going to copy and paste the hyperlink here so you could see it here. And I'm going to enter my username and password.com. I'm going to also enter my site, analytics, and connect. So this publishing tool accesses my Tableau Online, and it asks me if I want to connect to an individual data source, if I want to connect to a project name, and every time I run this workflow, if I want to create a new one, overwrite, or append the data. So let's say every single week you have data that is being refreshed. So you have a new site that gets put in, or you have historical information that's being loaded. If you append that data each and every single time, all you have to do is make sure that the connection to your data source is up to date. And every time this Ultrix workflow runs, it's going to take the data from the beginning, run through all those tools in order to clean it, do the spatial analysis on it, put in the correct predictive clusters, join the 2 data sets together, and then publish it to Tableau Online or the Tableau server. You can leave this running in the background so you have all this information that automatically gets posted to your server. Now, I just have Tableau Online for the purposes of this demo, but it's going to show you the same thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go to my Tableau Online and show you how this data came out. and how it looks like. So I'm going to go ahead to my client folder. This is where I published the data source, and I just called this hydro, and this is just still running in the background, so I'll update in a second. But before it does, I just wanted to show you how the data looks like. So here I have my data source that's created, and I could automatically create a new workbook with this data. And I can use this using Tableau's online web editor. So now I've kind of seamlessly transitioned from Ultrix to Tableau. Let me just make sure this ran successfully. Perfect. So I could look at my updated data and create a new workbook. Yep, just reposted it. So I have to go through, and it just got updated at 2:41 p.m. Perfect. So once I have this data all set, ready to go, I have those predictive components. I want to start building something meaningful so you can actually see how these results look like. In Tableau's web editor, I have an interface that shows the data at the left-hand side and the data that came in from Ultrix separated into dimensions and measures. You could think of dimensions and measures like those strings and those fields that I was looking at in order to create formulas on them. And a lot of my strings and my dates, you'll see little ABC icons, are essentially saying what all my dimensions are going to be. And my measures have these pound symbols beside them showing that I'm looking at numerical information, but it also contains some of my spatial info as well. So if I look at something like my centroid and double click that, oh, sorry. Yes, I do want to reset the view. So then if I look at my different centroids that I'm using, then I could create a map looking at that information. Just log on here. There we go. So what I did is I took a look at this centroid, and then I decided to look at the flow for each of these sites. And then I used this clustering in order to color code it in a way that was more meaningful. So once I double click that centroid, I have a point for each of these watershed communities or each of these potential hydro sites. And the cluster that I created is a cluster that puts them in each of these categories. If I see the numbering, it says 1, 3, and 4, and 2 is skipped altogether. The reason that number 2 was skipped is if you remembered, it only had 4 clusters in it, and that does not follow the proper clustering methodology, where if you have a grouping that's less than 5% of your total amount of data, then it's eliminated as a cluster just because it's not a proper representation of what you need. I also went ahead and put something like flow onto size to take a look at these clusters. These orange ones, so in group number 1, I could see automatically have higher flow. That's usually the theme that's throughout. Then most of my potential hydro sites are kind of this middle theme. And then, or the smaller sizes, for example, I have a lot around Western Ontario. And then I have number 4, which are kind of scattered throughout. So I could see all these different data points and how they look like. And I could also do various analysis on all the different watersheds in order to build a different dashboard. So I'm going to open up a new worksheet here. And I can look at something like each of the watersheds. So put that watershed on rows. I can look at the amount of potential energy that I would have. So the average that I would have at each watershed. Organize my data, and further do an analysis by looking at those clustering on the different colors and organize them as such. So I can really see which one of my watersheds. So if I look at the area that I'm living in, for example, Lake Ontario and Niagara Peninsula, I really have clusters 4 and 1. I don't have a lot in cluster 3. But if I look at Moose, for example, that is all my cluster is looking at 3. So I can now compare these two together, and I can also use the information about date that I created. So for example, I had to specifically change the date to be an effective date. So now when I bring in that specific date, I have the ability to have this automatic hierarchy that's created by looking at a breakdown of year and quarter. I can see how my flow changes between each one. I can see the total flow for each of the years, what that average head is measured over each of the years. I could go ahead and look at more information about the potential energy that could be created by looking at an average. And I could also go back and forth and look at these things as tables, or I can even change my views if I want by using Tableau's Show Me button. This will allow me to toggle through all the different options that I have in Tableau. So for example, looking at how the average head, the MW, and the flow changes throughout the years. Once all these sheets are created and put together, you can create a dashboard in order to look at these results. So if I went ahead and looked at all my different watersheds, looked at my map, and then how that trend line information looked over time, I could look at a breakdown of each of these fields. You can also do different customizations, like adding filters to go through one and the other. So what I mean by that is if I look at my watersheds, I can place a filter tool on each one. So if I want to see specifically where this region is, if I want to go specifically to the Lake Ontario Niagara region, that's just because where I live, I have a zoom up of the map on the bottom left-hand side. And I also have a breakdown of my crosstab that changes. I can see the area that I live in. I can see that most of the area here is looking at cluster 3. I have a big watershed area here that has cluster 4 and cluster 1 as well. And I could go back and automatically do an analysis and analyze which one of these clusters are which and what they mean. Again, I have flow on size, so it looks like I have a really large number of potential flow sites around Peterborough. And then also if I'm looking at around where I live, they're a little bit lower. You can also do a lot of other things in order to gain insights that can be done with Tableau Desktop. So let's say I created this workbook and I'm happy with it. I can also take this workbook and download it and open it up in Tableau Desktop. Now the view I have on Tableau Desktop, you'll automatically see is a little bit different than what I have online, is because I just changed some of the coloring. This stuff you could do on the server as well, but what you can't do on the server is update the custom tooltip. So whenever I hover over one of these sites, it tells me the ID, the latitude, and the longitude. But let's say I didn't want to show all the information. Instead, I wanted to customize it a bit. I wanted to show the site ID, and underneath I wanted to say what that specific watershed was, and I wanted to show some more information about the site name. I can customize the tooltip by adding my site name, for example, to the detail. I can add the watershed name as well, or even the water body name. And now if I go up into my tooltip and edit it, I can have things like the water body name and the site name underneath. So now when I hover each over one of these sites, not only do I have the ID, but I have all these different customizations that I can do. You can still publish this all onto Tableau server and use all these different changes. Another thing that you'll notice is that some of the mapping backgrounding has changed in the newer versions of Tableau. So you can change to a street or outdoors background. The reason you would do something like this is when you now zoom in on an area, it just adds a little bit more detail. So if I were to go to the Lake Ontario and Niagara region and zoom in, I have a little bit more labels that I already had shown. I have the streets, names, and the highways. And I could also publish all of this onto the server as well. So a bunch of different ways that you can show the flow of data from the beginning to the end, starting to take in this information, join it with a completely different data source, so spatial information, join the two data sets together and publish them directly to Tableau Online to do analysis. Now, there's also another cool feature that I want to show everyone on Tableau Desktop, and that's using the Ask Data functionality. So right now on Tableau Online, they're updating Ask Data. So I can't run it with this data set. Let me see. Yeah, I can't run it with this data set right now, but they have it available for me to try just on one of their internal servers. So looking at Ask Data, Tableau Ask Data. What it is essentially an interactive way that you could get your data and ask questions and insights about it using natural language processing that is going to create your fields and workbooks for you. So under Tableau's Ask Data, what you can do is you could start typing in, for example, what is my most profitable region in 2011? What is my highest sales? What are my top 5 use cases? It allows you to kind of take your data and start looking at each of these fields and typing them in. There's a great tool that they have online in order to start typing it in order to kind of see how it works. But it essentially just allows you to start typing in the different tools or the different questions that you have, and it'll show you different ways to look at your data. So when you connect, you'll have all your dimensions and measures at the bottom, and you could start typing in your question. So what's the average price by variety? And it's going to create all these views and visualizations for you. You can filter them, you can add more or less information depending on what you want to see. And you can also toggle between the different charts and alter your questions. As you alter your questions, you can start to essentially what the tool is used for is to gain more insights. And you can also change how the visualization looks. So first it was automatically shown as a bar graph, and then it was being shown as a tree map. So going through all of these different kind of features in order to create your own data set and end up with something that you can use. Yes, there is maintenance that is coming up. So you're all free to kind of look through this Ask Data and look at these features. So highest sales by country. Then when your data finally gets all linked together, in order to look at your results, you can show them all and look at this information all together. Great. So let me just get the here. So thank you so much to everybody for coming in and listening. I know it's a lot of content to put into the hour. Like Alex said, the session will be recorded and sent to you. So you'll be able to look at all these cool features available from inputting your data, different sources, the predictive grouping, the spatial, putting it on Tableau server, creating a different workflow, publishing it, and showing Ask Data as well. We do have some upcoming events. So we have new features from Tableau 2019.3 that you'll be able to see, and also a data analytics bootcamp that's in Calgary. Also, if you want to learn how to do any of these things in Tableau, we offer a variety of Tableau training. I'm a certified Tableau instructor. We have a few of them at NewComp that you'll be able to see and get training, whether you're more advanced or just a beginner looking at this for the first time. Same thing with Ultrix, will help prepare you for the certifications that they have if you're more interested in predictive concepts and how these kind of flow together with Tableau. We also have the Analytics 2.0 boot camps that are available for everybody to see. So thank you so much, everybody. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. But like I said, we'll be sending you this information. So if anybody has any questions in the future, they are able to let us know. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks.